Welcome to the Cycling Demystified 12 Days of Bike Fitting. If this is your first time here, I'm your host, Wei, lead bike fitter of Foundation Bike Fit, and I'll be joined by my fellow fitter Matt and our in-house mechanic Ev from Frequency Cycle Works. 2024 has been an amazing year for the podcast, and as we near the end of the year, we wanted to create a little something extra to say thanks to all of you for listening, for your feedback and for all of your support. So what we've done is asked bike fitters from around the world and friends of the podcast to contribute an actionable bike fit tip to help you find even more comfort, efficiency and performance in 2025. Each day in the lead up till Christmas, we will play one tip and then the team and I will explore each tip in a bit more detail so you can get the most from all these nuggets of gold. Day 6, and we have James Roberts from Fit to Ride with his tip.
Hi, it's James at Fit to Ride. I'm sat here on a cold, dark November evening in Yorkshire. And the guys at Foundation have very kindly asked me to come up with a Christmas bike fitting tip. And whether this is actually a tip or whether it's just something to think about, I'm not sure. But I think most people have some idea of those kind of 4 basic measurements that dictate the space you're sat in on the bike. You know, your reach, your drop, your seat height, your saddle setback. I think the 5th space that fewer people think about is the foot separation and the way that you position your feet. And I think if you want something to potentially take yourself forward, then I'd think about that. Because look, why do we care? Well, I think the way that you load the foot and the way that you position the foot has a massive impact on muscle recruitment, or on output, on injury prevention. And I think if, from a performance point of view, if you kind of just accept the bike industry's arbitrary 146, 147 millimetre wide drivetrain, then you're leaving something on the table, potentially. And I think even if you just want comfort and you don't consider that, then you're also leaving something on the table. And I think it's not as simple as just saying, well, you need these plus 4 millimetre axles, or you need 2 pillar washers. I think that kind of space can be, sometimes it's symmetrical, but sometimes it's asymmetrical. Your left foot needs more width than your right foot. But I think it is something that is well worth diving into at some point. And that's the tip. Happy Christmas, everyone.
All right.
That's food for thought, isn't it?
Yeah, more foot-related tips, which is great. And I think James is completely right in that we don't think about that foot stance, Q factor.
Stance width,
foot separation, all these terms. Basically, how wide do you place your feet? And it is very fixed when it comes to bikes. Mountain bikes have a slightly wider.
It tends to be based on how big's the tyre you want to fit in your bike, and that's what leads to stance width and Q factor and stuff like that, right?
Yeah, and there aren't huge. It's not very easy to adjust for Q factor. Would you say?
But effectively, stance width you affect by moving your cleat side to side, don't you? So you've got
one way to do it.
One way to do it.
Yeah.
It's minimal amounts of adjustment.
Yeah.
But I think what is mind-boggling, if you think about, so if you take like a bike like the Canyon Enduro Race, it goes down to 3XS and 2XL.
Yeah.
The Q factor on that bike is the same across the entire range.
Yeah.
Like across 7, 8 different sizes of bike, which is mind-bending. So, again, as we often say on this podcast, the bike industry does not have your best interests at heart. So you might need to explore a different solution for your body to position your feet relative to your hips in the most biomechanically effective way. And that sometimes means going narrower, not necessarily always going wider. So, Q factor and stance width, it works both ways. You need to find what works for you. And like I'm saying, how you load the foot and where the foot is relative to your hips can have a massive effect on everything in between. Yeah, how you're loading certain muscle structures, where your biases are, how you're loading certain joints.
Yep.
Over and over again. Yep. It's something that we don't think about often enough.
Yeah.
In the wider cycling kind of space, but
vitally
important.
Till you watch a kid riding a bike.
Well, yeah.
And then you see them.
Then you see
them.
Yeah.
But respecting Q factor and stance width is a great tip.
I think there's a very easy way that you can get an idea for how your body likes to function and what the effect. Yeah. Affect how the width or your stance width will affect it. And as you were saying, Matt, is just to go and do some squats, do good form squats, but you can very easily play around with where your feet are when you're squatting. Do it in front of a mirror, see what happens. Do you keep your feet straight and kind of front on, in line with your hips when you squat, or do they turn outwards slightly? What happens when you bring your feet close together? What happens when you bring your feet a little bit wider? Where feels comfortable? Do you tend to squat wide, or do you tend to squat narrow? And from that, essentially you can start to get a gauge for what might happen when you're on the bike too. Essentially, that's like this. We like the squat movement pattern because it essentially closes up the hip, compresses the kind of torso in the same way that you would do on the bike. And so let's say you have to assume quite a wide stance width to get low into your squat. If you can't do that on the bike in order to get into a low torso position, then your body will find some other way of compensating in order to get that room that it requires. And that might be, it will try to do it in maybe the similar kind of way of like kicking the knee outwards, or you might put your seat up in order to try and get
accommodate for that.
Yeah, get the hip range that you need. So there's lots of different ways that your body may try and compensate. But actually maybe what you need is to kind of get the right kind of width.
Is stance width the new crank length? We're going to start using it.
Interestingly, they work hand in hand.
Yeah.
Right. So there's two, like Wei was saying, there's two ways to deal with hip flexion. One is to reduce the amount of flexion at the top of the pedal stroke, or like reduce the effective depth of the squat. Or the other is to increase the amount of external rotation through the femur, the hip. And usually a combination of both is interesting to explore. But things like, obviously, crank length are pretty difficult to play with at home. But you have a little bit of adjustment on your cleats. So if you want to experiment with a slightly wider stance width, you can push your cleats towards the inside, the medial side of your shoe to bring your feet away from the frame. And if you want to experiment the opposite way, if you want to narrow your stance width and see what happens there, push your cleats towards the lateral side of the shoe, the outside of the shoe. So that's a pretty easy way to kind of experiment after you've maybe looked at yourself doing some squats, see what you do, what happens in certain stance widths, apply that to the bike. Just make one change at a time, so you can always put it back, take photos, document the starting position, and then experiment with it. But yeah, it's a great tip, I would say.
Yeah,
something that we need to think maybe more about.
Yeah, the feet can be a really good indicator of whether or not you may want to change your foot stance. Just paying attention to the pressures that you feel within your feet. So, for example, if you're feeling a lot of pressure on the outside of your foot, maybe your feet are trying to press outwards, and so that might mean that you want a kind of wider foot stance. And the opposite may be true as well. So if you're constantly trying to bring your feet in, that's where your body wants to be, then maybe you'll feel a little bit more pressure on the inside. And so, yeah, because the feet are attached and locked and in the same position each and every pedal stroke, then, paying attention to what your feet are trying to tell you may give you some clues. James's other point about having one foot may differ from the other is another interesting perspective to take on kind of how to position your bike and so on. And you'll realise that everyone is asymmetric. No, nobody functions like a robot. It's exactly the same on both sides. If you've got one side which has maybe a bit less mobility and needs a little bit more kind of accommodation, then you may be able to do that with kind of spreading the lateral position of the cleat out a little bit. Or some people have, structural differences in their bones, like their femurs might be, or their kind of hip socket maybe of a different construction, one side to the other, and that may require actually kind of a little bit of staggering of the cleats. But again, you don't really know until you start experimenting. So yeah, go forth, think about your feet, and play around. Thanks for listening, and tune in tomorrow for another bike fit tip from the Cycling Demystified 12 Days of Bike Fitting. If you've enjoyed what you've heard or found any of the information has made a difference for your riding, we would be super grateful if you could do two things. Firstly, we'd love it if you could leave us a 5-star rating or review, as this really helps other riders find our podcast and access the same useful information you've been enjoying. Secondly, tell your friends on the next group ride to give us a listen. The more you can spread the word, the more riders can find a better ride. Thanks again, and catch you on the next one.
Suffering from numb hands, tingling toes, and any other persistent discomforts when you ride? These are all signs that your bike fit could be improved. If you're bike fit curious, get in touch with Way or Matt by emailing info@foundation.fit or finding them on Instagram @FDN_bikefit. Finally, for all your bike servicing needs, custom dream bike or hand-built wheels, go to www.frequencycycleworks.com or find me on Instagram @frequencycycleworks. Until next time, keep on spinning.